Grace and peace to you in the name of the triune God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. I didn't watch the 10 Commandments on Easter night growing up, but I know many people who did. And I think part of the reason that movie resonated so much was because this is one of those classic Sunday school stories. The Israelites are running from the Egyptians who have enslaved them, trying to reach freedom. The Egyptian army is in hot pursuit of these scrappy underdogs. Moses, at the head of the band of escaping Israelites, reaches the edge of the sea, stretches out his arm, and the waters part so that they can escape. The Egyptians rush into the sea behind them and are drowned when the waters crash down on top of them. Most of us probably think about the Charlton Heston movie when we read this story, although I'll confess I had to Google it. There's something so dramatic about the entire Egyptian army in hot pursuit of the Israelites, and then Charlton Heston spreading out his arms above the sea and calling on the Israelites to witness the power and might of God working to save them. The sea parts in an instant, and the path is made clear for them to follow. What a great scene. Danger lies ahead and behind. Freedom or escape seems to be beyond what they could hope for. Action seems to bubble up and boil over and be done. How many of you, when you read this story or hear a retelling of it, think of it as a race? How many of you feel your heart beating just a little faster, maybe even secretly crossing your fingers as you might have done as a kid, hoping that the Israelites still managed to get there first and escape? When we take our theological perspectives from Hollywood, something is lost in the translation. So let's explore what's really happening here. We think of the Israelites as the protagonists of this story. After all, they're the ones wandering in the wilderness. They're the ones seeking to flee from slavery in Egypt to find freedom in the land that has been promised to them. But in reality, this is a story about God's creative and redemptive force in the world. At the beginning of today's text, the Israelites had been allowed to leave after the night of the Passover, when the firstborn of all Egyptian families were put to death by God. They've been wandering in the wilderness, led by the pillars of cloud and fire. And they're a little tired of it. It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die here in the desert. This is the first time they say this, but it won't be the last. They're barely out of Egypt and they're already grumbling. That's an easy thing to do when we feel directionless, isn't it? It can be a pretty overwhelming feeling, and I think it's fair to say we've all had at least a taste of that in the last few years. There have been major political and social upheavals here in the U.S. and around the world. We've faced a global pandemic that overturned our lives overnight, how we did our jobs and interacted with our neighbors, what we did for fun, even how we were community together. And it seems as though we're coming out on the other side of that now, only to be faced with more upheaval, rising inflation and the looming threat of a recession, fears over the loss of individual civil rights, ongoing wars and threats of wars around the globe, the growing national and international threat of Christian nationalism and other forms of fascism. Like the Israelites, we are short-sighted. When things are going wrong, when we are beset by dangers on every side, it's much easier to see the enemy than it is to see God. It's much easier to succumb than to lift our faces to God and stand on our faith. When we seem to be beset by wave after wave of existential crisis, the fear threatens to consume us. Then the question for us, as for the Israelites, is who will we serve? Will we serve God, or will we serve Pharaoh and all that Pharaoh represents? The empire, the military and economic might of the world, the powers that be that would have dominion over us. But that's the thing. Even in the midst of God's story, we tend to center ourselves. We tend to think about how God is working in our lives for us more than we think about how God is working through us for others. And so when we don't clearly and quickly see how God is working for us, we tend to complain about it. But God has a word for the Israelites delivered through Moses. Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and you will see the victory God will win for you today. Though you see Egypt today, you will never see it again. God will do the fighting for you. You only have to keep still. There are a few pieces of this statement that I want to lift up. Don't be afraid. We want to scoff a little at this, don't we? Yeah, right, we want to say. Don't tell me how to feel. But this statement isn't meant to be an imperative. It's meant to be a word of comfort. It's meant to be a reassurance. God will ensure that our worst fears, whatever they may be, will not be realized. And if these words sound familiar, they should. Think of the angel Gabriel appearing first to Mary and then to the shepherds. I'm not here to threaten or hurt you, is the sentiment these words are meant to convey. I'm here to help you. Stand your ground, which is often translated stand firm. If we were to go back to the end of the 13th chapter of Exodus, we would read that when the Israelites left Egypt, they were prepared for battle. But here, God is telling us to stay put. We are not here to fight, but we're not to run away either. We are here to observe what it is that God is doing to accomplish salvation. We are here to wait. How often do we do this? How often do we look around at the world and see God in action? How often do we wait for God? Not often enough. It's easy on days when we can see new life or new growth, or when we can marvel at a beautiful sunset or the fall foliage. But what about on the days when everything around us seems to be falling apart? What about on the days when our dollars just don't seem to stretch as far as we would like, or when we don't see a path forward through political and social upheaval and the threat of disease? Those are the days when we especially need to stand our ground, to look for God. Those are the days when we need to wait instead of forging ahead on our own path, because that doesn't tend to turn out well for us. Keep still. This is not a call to be as silent as a mouse so that we don't attract the attention of threats that beset us. It is not a call to assume that God will do everything for us and we won't have to lift a finger. Instead, this is a call to listen, a reminder that when we wait for God, we are not passive. We are anticipating God's call to us. And when we wait, when we allow ourselves to be comforted, when we stand firm and observe, when we keep still and listen, we are able to see deliverance. God's work of salvation is happening in us, to us, and around us, to the world all the time. The question is, are we aware of it? Or are we too caught up in our own fears, our own fighting stance, our own desire to hurry up and act, that we miss it? And then in the midst of their keeping still and listening, the Israelites hear God's call to follow Moses into the canyon of water. And they follow. And now the commands, don't be afraid and stand firm, ring louder than ever. There is nothing in Exodus that tells us how high the water walls are, but we know that the water is deep enough to drown the Egyptian charioteers and their horses. How much faith would it take to walk between these walls of water and to believe that God will not let them drown. What an opportunity to observe God's creative and salvific power at work. What an opportunity to follow where God calls, to act as God asks them to act. If we were to read just a little farther in Exodus, we would come to the hymn of praise that Moses and the Israelites sing. To you, O God, I sing. You have triumphed powerfully. Horse and charioteer you have flung into the sea. God is our strength and our courage. You have become our deliverance. God is continually working to create and save the world. Theologian Terence Fretheim says that the character of our human response to God's creative and salvific work shapes the nature of our participation. Do we allow ourselves to be comforted by God's presence, standing firm to observe and keeping still to listen to how God is working to bring salvation not only to us, but to all of creation? Do we see signs of hope, even in the unlikeliest of places? We are not the protagonists of God's story. We are called to wait, to be comforted, to watch, and to listen. And then we are called to follow. In this Stewardship Month, I invite you to discern how God is calling you to use your time. Are you called to a time of faithful waiting? Or are you called to a time of faithful action? As a community, we're entering a time of waiting, of observing and listening. A week ago, Carla and I attended a Faithful Innovations workshop, the first of 3 sessions in a year-long journey of discerning how God is calling us as a congregation and as a church, and then acting on that call. We invite you on this journey as we take time to observe and listen to who we are as God's people in this place, and as we discern how God is calling us to service and stewardship of our faith and our resources in our community and in the world. Although our journey will likely not be as dramatic, as filled with dread and threat as the Israelites' journey through the Red Sea was, discernment leads to change. Even if we don't do anything different, we will be transformed. What is the character of our response to God's work in and through us? What will be the nature of our participation? God invites us to be not afraid, to stand firm, and to be still as we listen and look for God in our midst. Amen.